Hello, I'm going to make this video to explain the passive voice. Let's start by looking at some examples. I was born in 1996. Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. English is spoken in the USA. Let's look at example number 2. Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. So, let's look at the structure. The subject is the person who wrote the book. So the subject is Cervantes. Normally, the subject goes at the beginning of the sentence, but in passive voice, it does not. It goes here, at the end. So, the object is the thing that is being written, which is the book Don Quixote. The object goes at the beginning. Object, subject. Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. Now, what we have in the middle is the verb to be in the past form, was. Now, we have the verb to write in the past participle form. You might remember from your verbs wrap, your irregular verbs wrap, write, wrote, written. So we have to have the past participle form written. Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. Now let's compare the passive voice with the active voice, which is the type of sentence we normally use. So we have our passive example, which we already saw. Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. And now we have the active voice, which is what we normally use. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. So, if we have the active voice, why do we use the passive? In this case, it's because Don Quixote, the book, is more important. We're talking about the book right now, not the author. If you look at the different structures, you'll see that in the passive voice, the object, which is the book Don Quixote, comes first because it's more important. In the active voice, the subject, the person who is writing the book, or Cervantes, comes first because he is more important. Now, let's imagine that Tommy is playing with his baseball. He throws the baseball too hard and it goes into the window of his neighbor's house and it breaks the window. The neighbor is angry because he has a broken window, but he doesn't know who broke it. So he can't say, Tommy broke the window. Instead, he says, the window is broken. Here you see the passive structure because we don't know who broke it. So we start with the object, the window, then we have the verb to be in the present form, is. Then we have the past participle of to break, which is broken. Break, broke, broken. So in the passive form, we have the sentence, the window is broken. Now the neighbor wants to know who threw the baseball? So he can ask, who was the baseball thrown by? The baseball was thrown by Tommy. In this sentence, the baseball is more important, the object. So we start with the baseball at the beginning of the sentence. Then we have the passive form was thrown. We have the verb to be in past form, was, and the past participle of to throw. Throw, threw, thrown. The baseball was thrown by Tommy. Tommy is the subject, so he goes at the end instead of at the beginning, because what's more important now is the baseball. Let's review the structure with the examples we have now. So, in order to make the passive voice, we first have the object, then the verb to be, then the past participle, and then the subject if we know who the subject is. In example number 1, we have the baseball was thrown by Tommy. We have the object, which is the baseball, the thing that was being thrown, the thing that the action was being done to. Then we have the verb to be in past simple, which is was. Then we have the past participle of the verb to throw, which is thrown. And since we do know who the subject is, the person who is doing the action, we can include his name, Tommy. Usually, if you have a subject at the end of the sentence, you'll say by. The baseball was thrown by Tommy, because you want to know who was doing the action. Now we have example number 2. In example number 2, we don't know who did the action, which means we don't know the subject. So it's okay in the passive voice not to include the subject. That's why it's in parentheses. Let's look at example number 2. First we have the object, which is the window. Then we have the verb to be in past simple, was. Then we have the past participle of the verb break, which is broken. And since we don't know the subject, we leave it blank. And that's the end of the sentence. The window was broken. Now let's look at some of the reasons why we use the passive voice in English. One reason is if the object of the sentence is more important than the subject. We saw that in the example with Tommy and his baseball, when it said the baseball was thrown by Tommy. In that case, the object, which was the baseball, was more important. We can also use it if the subject is unknown. We saw that in the other example of the window. The window was broken. In that case, we didn't know who broke the window, which means we didn't know the subject. So we used passive voice. Another reason we can use passive voice is to speak generally about an action. Let's review the third reason we use the passive voice. We can use it to speak about an action in general. For example, English is spoken in the USA. Libraries are used to borrow books. In both of these cases, the subject are people in general. We could also say, people speak English in the USA. But what's more important in this sentence are not the people, but the language, English. So instead of saying people speak English in the USA, we can use the passive voice because the object is more important and say, in general, English is spoken in the USA. It's the same thing in example number 2. We could also say, people use libraries to borrow books. But that's speaking in general, so the people aren't as important as the libraries. So we use the passive voice to say, libraries are used to borrow books. In both of these examples, you'll see the same structure. The object, the verb to be, and the past participle. Now you know how to use the passive voice. Do the worksheets and give it a try.